Hey, this is Ken Fecho with Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. I'm the Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and help OWEB review monitoring grant applications when they come in and really help our RPRs and other project managers administer monitoring grants over the life of the grant, and help also review the project completion reports to help close monitoring grants out. I just want to welcome all of you. All the folks that we invited are either applicants or grantees that monitoring grants that have a component that includes water quality monitoring. Maybe I'll just let Nick and Steve introduce themselves, and then we'll go on to the next slide.
Hi, I'm Steve Hansen. I work here at the DEQ laboratory with Nick. I'm a monitoring coordinator, worked for a long time in the volunteer monitoring position, and have been involved in the data management and still pretty involved in the data management side of things for the program.
And my name is Nick Haxton Evans. Just recently turned into Haxton Evans, was married a couple months ago. I always like to get that out there. I am the current volunteer monitoring program coordinator. I am the person responsible for a lot of different things that we'll be talking about today when participating with the volunteer monitoring program. We will go into all the details of pretty much what I'm going to be helping out with in all of the grantee process.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So thanks again for everybody for joining, and look forward to covering a lot of material today with you guys to help you better administer your OWEB monitoring grant that has a component of water quality monitoring. And so what I wanted to do was just give a little bit of background on introducing this topic, where there are a variety of monitoring grant reporting requirements in your grant agreement, and that's usually found in Exhibit B and Exhibit C. And you should be very familiar with what those are when you receive that grant agreement to review it before you sign it. And some of you, again, are either applying for funds or about to get a grant agreement, or currently are working under a monitoring grant agreement. And one of those reporting requirements that we're really talking about today is to submit your water quality data to DEQ. And this has been a monitoring requirement for quite some time. And the intent of these monitoring funds are for the data to inform and benefit local interests, but it's also to benefit the state of Oregon to meet their needs. And this has been a clear expectation of our board that I have heard over the last 6 years. And so by sharing data with DEQ, it can be made widely available. And these are state resources that we're providing. And as we all know, there's limited funds for monitoring in Oregon. So really the idea is to leverage local interests and efforts to also help benefit the state's needs. Later in the webinar, we're going to talk about how you meet these reporting requirements, and also talk about that level of quality assurance required to use OWEB funds for water quality. The purpose of this webinar, you'll see a theme throughout, it really is to encourage early communication with grantees and DEQ. And really that point of contact is Nick Haxton Evans. And if you guys already don't know how to get in touch with him, later on in this presentation has his contact information. But the idea is really to be working early on, either when you're preparing your application or once you receive your grant and you have read the grant agreement, to get involved with them to help develop and review any quality assurance documents, and to understand how to meet the data submission requirements early in the process. Some of the grants are really straightforward with only one parameter being monitored, and those are typically easier to report. But some of the grants that you guys have several different parameters. There's a combination of grab and continuous data, and that will require a little bit more work to manage the data to submit to DEQ. And we want you to be proactive to figure this out, and before you go to close your grant out. A lot of you guys want the closing out of that grant to be efficient, not get drawn out. And so the earlier you work with DEQ, the easier it will be to meet those reporting requirements and close your grants out. So Nick and Steve will explain later here on There's also other benefits and incentives to working with DEQ early in your water quality monitoring grant. So I just kind of wanted to lay that out, sort of the background and purpose of this webinar today.
Great, Ken. Thanks. I think the rest of the slides in our presentation will kind of cover the specifics, but I think, yeah, it's important to realize that we're a resource here at the DEQ for all OWEB grantees in pretty much every step of the process. So just want to emphasize that we're here for everyone, but it's usually just us that's available for everyone. So just keep in mind that getting in touch with us early and being communicative is kind of the key to kind of moving smoothly through the process. Before we kind of continue on with the specifics of OWEB grantees and the process that we're going through, I thought I'd give a little background of the volunteer monitoring program. Some of you on the line have probably worked with Steve in the past years and myself this past year since I've been in the position, but maybe some of you on the line aren't that familiar with kind of the background of the volunteer monitoring program here at the DEQ lab. The origins of the program kind of are rooted in the Oregon plan way back in the 90s, where endangered species listings for salmonids and anadromous fishes were kind of getting brought up, and so the state of Oregon put together an emphasis on kind of getting some restoration acts by private landowners with an emphasis on a lot of different processes, but one of them being a strong scientific monitoring or strong scientific oversight on what kind of work is being done to protect waterways. And over the years, the program has kind of expanded, and our relationship with OWEB as a funding source for a lot of the equipment that we provide, and our relationship with OWEB and OWEB grantees has kind of grown and been really important. One of the objectives, or the list of objectives there on the screen for volunteer monitoring program was to expand and support volunteer monitoring efforts, and we can do this in many ways. But one of them is to form high-quality monitoring or provide high-quality monitoring equipment and supplies to groups that are doing effectiveness monitoring or other kinds of monitoring. We encourage consistent data collection techniques and improving the data quality collected by volunteer organizations by really kind of coming up and developing standardized procedures, providing trainings for groups so that procedures and methods are conducted in a consistent way. And we also provide support to get data collected out to the public and used and to become useful for not just for the groups that are collecting it, but for the DEQ and for the state and for the public in general. And we do this by providing a platform where different groups can communicate about problem or solutions they found to problems during monitoring. We have guidance for analysis of their data, and then again making the data available to the broader public. This is a flow chart of kind of where the volunteer monitoring support exists, and then, to be perfectly honest, it exists in every step of this flow, from giving or providing advice for any kind of monitoring questions you might have, and then after OWEB grant funds have been approved, we're highly involved in the sampling analysis plan development. We provide training to groups to get more familiar with their monitoring methodologies. We provide equipment and supplies for the monitoring. We are available to conduct quality assurance visits and help with monitoring questions, solving any problems and troubleshooting problems that you have, and also providing split sampling and things like that to kind of verify quality assurance. And then once the monitoring is done, we are very much involved in the data management, getting the data in, performing analysis in some cases, helping you do that process and getting it in submission templates, and getting the data to the DEQ. And then as part of your closing out your grants, we provide the confirmation that your data has been submitted to the DEQ. Ken, did you want to touch on that part?
Thanks, yes. The next slide here is quality assurance, quality control. From OWEB's perspective, the quality assurance documentation and monitoring plans are really important. Some of that information is included in the applications to OWEB, but there's a lot of other details that are included in either quality assurance project plans, which is a QAPP, and or a sampling and analysis plan. And so for us, that additional QA documentation is super helpful for the organization leading the monitoring effort. It's also required and needed from DEQ's perspective, and so some of you already work under an existing QAPP and or SAP. And that would need to be, sort of kept up to date, and we really want to do that. Some of the folks, they apply for another round of funding, and some of that project changes in some regard, either sites or parameters, or they might bring another partner on to collect another piece of data, and we just want to be clear that these are living documents, and there is an expectation to have those updated and revised over time, and you also might see that language in your grant agreement requirements, which is typically in Exhibit B. So with that, I'll turn that over back to Nick and Steve to cover the details.
So this is Steve. I just want to touch briefly on we talk about QAPPs and SAPs, and just give a sense of how we consider those to be different. If you've seen both of them, you'll notice that they're essentially the same document. They have the same outline. They cover the same material. The quality assurance plans in the DEQ quality system world, SAPs exist generally underneath an umbrella quality assurance plan. That just is for efficiency's case. So in the case of the volunteer program, there's a volunteer program QA plan that covers a lot of the general information, covers the normal parameters, the different quality control procedures that are recommended, some data management information, and all of those sorts of materials. But it's up to each organization to define their sampling problem and talk to the specifics of their program and identify which elements of the quality assurance umbrella plan that are going to be relevant for their program. And so you can maybe see that if your analysis plan, your sample analysis plan gets kind of too far out from underneath the umbrella of what the QA plan covers. So if you're doing different types of parameters, for example, than what's covered in the QA plan, then you may need to either supplement the SAP with additional information, or in some cases it might be more efficient just start with the QA plan from scratch.
Right, and so the emphasis is that the Volunteer Water Quality QAPP is available kind of as a reference and a simplifying tool for groups that want to kind of lean on that already standardized information and quality assurance information and procedures to kind of borrow from that to build your own project SAP. But it's not required to utilize that one. If your project is unique and doesn't really utilize a lot of the parameters, or there's some divergence from kind of the standardized way that we look at the monitoring parameters that we have available, developing your own QAPP will be necessary. But I think it's important, and as Ken and Steve emphasized, having this quality assurance plan is essential to kind of standardize the quality of your data, and as it comes into the DEQ, so that we can kind of give it an evaluation and know what quality assurance steps were taken to ensure good data. For those of you interested or who aren't familiar, the Volunteer Water Quality QAPP is available on our webpage. I'll send that link up here soon. And we also have kind of a template SAP that people can utilize to kind of develop their SAP as you go through those steps. It kind of just a way to facilitate particularly some of the simpler or more straightforward projects. That might be the simplest way, is to kind of look at the QAPP and then utilize the template to develop your own SAP. Along those lines, in short order here, we will be conducting an update. Some of you may have noticed that the QAPP that is currently on the website is somewhat outdated, has some different information about our data management, things like that. So that update and revision will be happening here in this month and get up on the website in June. Same with the SAP template that I spoke about. That will be updated as well to kind of match the changes in the QAPP. But up until that time, if people are interested in starting this process prior to that, you're more than welcome to use the current QAPP and SAP template that are up there. They're still very functional, and we can address any of the changes that need to be made as we go along through that process. Part of my role as the Volunteer Monitoring Program Coordinator and facilitating the processing and the data that comes into the DEQ from your grant projects is to review and kind of conduct an approval of your SAP or your QAPP if you decided to do a separate QAPP. And it's important to emphasize that this is an important document. This SAP will go on file with our DEQ Lab Quality Assurance Officer to coincide with the data as it comes into our database. And it's important for many reasons. The documents the data for other users, so if people were to see your data as it becomes public, they can kind of trace back and trace the quality assurance steps taken. It helps us review your data to see what you were doing and how that data was, how that quality control procedures were utilized. And in the future, especially with multi-year projects, there's often change in staff around a project, and this SAP should be clearly defined so that if someone down the road steps into your position or takes over the project based on workload or whatever reason, this SAP will act as a very important guide for people who will be continuing your project. So the key, probably you'll hear this throughout the webinar over and over again, just plan ahead. When developing your SAP or your QAPP and interacting with me and or Steve when he's kind of tagged to kind of help out, it's important to plan ahead, realize that the review process does take a lot of time. Like I said before, I'm here to help everyone as much as I can, but I have everyone to help. So it is important that I know ahead of time what your timelines are looking like and clearly communicating what your needs will be. There's a seasonality to these things. As most of you know, some of this monitoring is only done during certain months, and trying to pile in a bunch of SAP reviews at the beginning of the season can be very difficult for me. So again, communication is key. The length of review and approval might have to do with the complexity of your project plan, what parameters you're conducting, how those, if they're new parameters and we don't have established quality assurance items for that, it might take some extra time for me to do some research and work with you and find some appropriate quality assurance methods. But it's key to point out that we really emphasize that your sampling cannot start or should not start until that SAP has been approved. Yeah, utilize the template, ask questions, get in touch with me early. There might be some back and forth about edits and changes and things like that. So again, don't wait till the last minute right before you're ready to sample to submit your SAP for review. There are a few very standard parameters that the Volunteer Monitoring Program has assisted with over the years. And we have equipment and supplies and provide trainings for all of these kind of basic monitoring parameters, instantaneous flow, continuous and instantaneous temperature, turbidities, conductivities, dissolved oxygen. We're starting to develop a good familiarity with continuous dissolved oxygen monitoring. So if you have questions about that, that's something that we are developing more quality assurance procedures for helping out with that. Now, also bacteria, utilizing the IDEX E. coli system. If you're planning on sampling for nutrients, solids, or benthic macroinvertebrates, we do not have the support for analysis for these types of samplings, so you'll likely have to go through a third-party lab. But we will assist in any way we can with the sampling and the data management and analysis. So again, as part of our monitoring support, we can help identify parameters, provide assistance with methodologies. But like I mentioned before, if you have new parameters that are not standard kind of to our program, we'll have to work early together to try and develop a good way to get those planned out. There are often things such as continuous flow, other biological sampling like fish sampling, where you might be kind of referenced to a different department, not the DEQ, but maybe OWRD or ODFW to help you kind of work out the specifics of your planning and monitoring if it has to do with those particular things.
Hey everybody, this is Ken Fetcher with OWEB. We do have contacts for other state natural resource agencies, monitoring coordinators that you could contact. Either Nick can give you their contact information, or myself. We also have their contact information on OWEB's Monitoring Grants webpage, with their email and phone numbers on there as well. So there are a couple different ways you can contact key people to help get more information on, maybe habitat sampling or fish, or you're interested in running continuous gauges.
Yeah, contacting me or contacting them directly is recommended. Ken pointed this out earlier, but another aspect of your sample analysis plan is that your projects can evolve, especially, again, multi-season or multi-year sampling. You might have some changes or realize that some things aren't working for you. But it is important to come back to that sample analysis plan or QAPP and document those changes, not just in your own paperwork, but with us, so that we know how the data is being collected, and so we can change our documentation on file to show more accurately how the data is being collected and how it will be coming in. Things change, and you need to be flexible in the monitoring world, and we're aware of that. So just more communication and planning ahead with us helps out a lot.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and kind of take this discussion to what happens with the data itself. I want to give a little bit of information on sort of the landscape of the data management world at DEQ that has been, particularly over the last several years, a little kind of a moving target. So I want to give folks an update on that process and give you a sense of what happens with the data as it, after you send it to the DEQ. On the screen here, I have Laser and AWOMS as the two different data management systems that you may see referenced. Laser is no longer active. It is the old system that we had. We haven't gotten around to updating lots of documents, so you might see Laser listed. I would just kind of think of it as a surrogate for DEQ's data management. The new system is the AWOMS data system. And the primary thing I want you to come away with from this is that Laser was and AWOMS is the repository for data that has been reviewed and released by DEQ. There's lots of infrastructure that exists underneath of each of them, and some of them are quite large, complex systems and processes, and that maybe is my excuse for why it's taken us so long to transition. It was in 2013 where the LIMS system, which is what fed Laser, was updated to a new system when we lost our ability to put new data into the Laser data system. And so the results of that sort of cascaded down through the rest of the process, and so it's been maybe a year or so that AWOMS has been up and running at DEQ. So we can say now that Laser is no more. It's been put to rest. All the data that was in Laser, or at least the vast majority of it, has been migrated to AWOMS, and so that's where the data is going to at this time. The other thing I just want to make sure is clear is that there are several processes. At the bottom of the screen is the submission templates that you should be familiar with as you fill out the sample analysis plan, and that I think we're going to talk some more about. But there's several steps from the submission template. There's some station creation that we have to do, and some file preparation that we do to take a little bit of the burden off of the data provider, so that we can feed the data into our scripts that we've developed that help us process the data, and then we feed the data into a local database that is migrating to a SQL database actually, that we use to review the GRAB water quality data, and then depending on whether we handle GRAB data and continuous data a little bit differently, but in both instances the data ends up migrating to the AWOMS database, and the AWOMS database serves as the repository for the reviewed data. Part of the reason that we chose the AWOMS database is that it does feed into Storette and or into the water quality portal, which ends up putting the data in the same, you can view data from NWIS, the USGS data, and all of the Storette data and a couple of other data sources all in one location. The key here, and if you've been in the program for a while and already submitted data, you've hopefully already received a request. I think they're called a consent request that we need to get filled out and filed with CDX. It's the EPA data exchange folks, saying that we have permission to transfer your data from our webpage, AWOMS database, through the Water Quality Exchange and into Storette, where it becomes available on the portal. The flow to Storette is, and to the Water Quality portal is great. It does mean that we need to be really careful that data that's being submitted to us has not found other means to get into Storette. So if you're, for example, if you're working with the Bureau of Reclamation Laboratory, in Boise, they automatically put their data into Storette, so we need to make sure, and this is one place in the SAP where we can really identify on an analyte by analyte basis which of your parameters are being analyzed by whom, and if that data is going to be going into Storette, because we need to avoid creating redundant data in Storette or in the portal. Same as if you're partnering with USGS and they're putting their data into the NWIS system, we need to make sure that we don't create redundant data that way. So that's going to be critical in defining your data management for each analyte. The data that is going into AWOMS, again, it comes in as the submission template, and then it's got several steps that it needs to get through to get into AWOMS, and it's only the reviewed data that goes in. Part of the review process is that we review the quality assurance data that's available to us, and we assign what we used to call data quality levels, that we've kind of used this grading system in the past. And so data that we feel like we have enough information about the method and knowledge about the method, and there's enough quality control data that we feel like we can make some statement that we feel like it's good data. Those will be what we call A, and if it's qualified in some way, B data. And those data go into AWOMS as a status of final. They also, in AWOMS, they also have a qualifier, a result qualifier that will say like DQL equals whatever. Although that qualifier doesn't translate all the way through to Storette at this time. And then data that we determine to have an issue that is bad data, if there's equipment failures, that sort of thing. That also gets flagged with a data quality level of C, sometimes D in certain instances. That's considered rejected data. It's not available. And then if there's just insufficient data for us to assess the data quality, that data it's what the old E-level data is what you might see around as referenced. That goes in, it gets flagged as provisional data in AWOMS and in Storette. So that's the data that goes in. The types of data include all the grab water quality data. For continuous data, we calculate basic daily metrics, things like max and mins, and for some, like temperature, we'll do the 7-day moving average of the maxima, daily maxima. And then AWOMS also has continuous tables that we populate, and also biological metric data. The continuous log data is not supported currently by Storette, so you won't be able to get that through the portal. And there are a few of the biological metrics, like our ODE predator scores, that we still need to get created in Storette for them to show up there. But they are, all of these are available on AWOMS, but there is a few things that still need to be worked out to get the data into StoreAt. Sorry. And then in terms of how the data gets used, the primary purposes are the integrated report or the 303D list assessments, where we query data, all of the available data to compare to water quality standards to figure out if beneficial use criteria are being met. And then also there's been a big demand in the last few years to start using this data for status and trend reports. And so all of the data that goes in as final, which is in the old language, that's data quality level A or B, gets used for both of those purposes, for the integrated report and for the status and trend reports. And both of those are available online, or information about both of those are available online. But then it's also available, it's quite often used as we're planning new work, trying to see what data is available. And then sometimes, particularly in the TMDL development world, it will be used to help improve the water quality models that are being used. That's kind of the summary of the data landscape for DEQ.
Thanks, Steve. One thing to keep in mind, and we try to emphasize this with our applicants before our application is submitted, but because the data is, if you have water quality monitoring component, is required to submit to DEQ and will be made publicly available, we just wanted to make sure that you guys are keeping that in mind when you're working with local landowners, maybe for site access and involvement in the project, because some landowners may not be interested in that, and it is a reporting requirement. And so if that is the case, you do want to collect property or water quality data on private property to meet your local needs, and they don't want to share it with DEQ, then we advise you to not pursue OWEB funds for that project. When you're closing out your monitoring grant, there is an area where you have to provide confirmation that your data was submitted to DEQ, and often we have people ask us, what constitutes confirmation from DEQ. And so for us, and so it's an email from Nick or Steve saying that you have submitted your data. Ideally, it's the summary email that they give you that has, the number of measurements per parameter and sort of that quality, the data quality rating. So that for us is what we would like to see uploaded to AWOMS. For one, that helps us understand what parameters, because we're looking at your monitoring application for what you proposed to collect and how many sites and numbers of years to collect the data. And so that helps us kind of get an understanding of what was submitted to DEQ. And also that data quality is also important for us to understand, to see if that information is able to be stored in OWEB. I think that's just helpful information for us. In some cases where Steve and Nick are behind and haven't reviewed the data, but you've submitted it, we will accept that email confirmation that we've received your data. This is the information you sent us, and it's under review, because that if you've reported everything else, then you have met that requirement in the grant agreement.
Okay, thanks. I think the emphasis there is getting the data to us in a form that we can accept. The DEQ website, webpage for the Volunteer Monitoring Program has Excel templates available, and that's the format that we're going to need data submitted in. We both have a grab data, or like an instantaneous data format, as well as a continuous data format. They can take some time to fill out, because there's some metadata, some side data that we're going to need to accompany the data when you submit it to have it kind of work in our system. So I want to emphasize that probably when you're developing your SAP and communicating with me at the beginning of the project, it's very useful to take a look at these templates ahead of time, because it might shape the way that you collect or store data over the time period of your monitoring and simplify the process when you get to the time to submit. I think it's important that to know that it will take time for not only for you to get the data in the right format, but it will also take time for Steve and or I to get the data processed.
Yeah, I would just throw in a comment here that there's also help documentation that goes with each one of the PDF, I believe, that goes with each of the templates, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that and make sure you understand which fields are required and which are optional, and any of the required data we basically can't move forward with any of the data processing until we have all of that required data. So it's good to get a handle, and hopefully there's some useful information in those help documents that could help you move things through there.
We have a timeline. We do get a lot of data kind of coming at us throughout the year, but as people kind of approach the end of their grants, obviously you're in a hurry to get things in so you can get that grant submission closed out. So we want to help you in any way we can, but we will need time to do that. So working, again, plan ahead, work out a timeline with me when you're getting ready to submit data, so that we can give each other enough time to get the data in the right format and to get it reviewed.
Gentlemen, may I ask a question? This is Marty from Harney Soil and Water Conservation District.
Sure, go ahead.
For clarity, and maybe jumping back to Ken's comment about data, and if there is an exceedance or violation, that is held. Can you walk through that internal control process between, I realize that ODA is still the regulatory body on ag water quality, but if the data is indicating a violation, will you talk about that in this webinar, or is that something that we talk about on our local monitoring team as far as communication process, internal controls, so that we, working with the private landowners, can make sure that that's clearly articulated before we enter into our agreements for access?
Are you talking about like a water quality violation, like a criteria violation?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'll try to speak to that a little bit. The wheels for that process have been greased over the last couple of years so that there won't be as long of a turnover as there has been in the recent history. But so those determinations are supposed to be determined every 2 years in terms of when data gets pulled out and compared against criteria. There's public comments and all that sort of stuff, and then the EPA approves the 303D list, is the sort of the portion of the integrated report that actually refers to this particular segment of the stream has data that indicates that there's a violation. I should say the only follow-up that I am familiar with for that realization that there's a water quality violation there is that the DEQ is then responsible to develop a TMDL for that area. There's a lot that goes on there, and is that the type of feedback that your question was getting at?
I guess from a scenario, if we're out on a John Q, so we're out on John Q's property, bacteria samples are showing this stream stretch has already had TMDL. Bacteria is an exceedance of what is listed in the TMDL, and you'll have to bear with me because I'm a rookie district manager. I'm not a techie person, but I get the phone calls from the landowners.
Right.
What does that look like, I guess, as far as, because this is going to be fed up to EPA through your DEQ system, do we address it immediately? Do we take corrective actions? Do we submit that to DEQ? Maybe, I've never been in this situation before. Maybe somebody that's walked in these shoes could help me understand so that I could better articulate it to our landowners and my directors and interested parties.
Like I say, I don't feel like I'm super qualified, but I will. There are a couple things that you should know. One thing is that the DEQ will pretty much never use third-party data for any type of enforcement. We just don't open ourselves up to that exposure.
Yeah, okay.
Part of the idea of the whole volunteer monitoring program is that, local solutions happen a lot faster than statewide solutions. So
Yes, sir.
we would hope that, that it's a landowner that you can engage with and try to make improvements to the water quality, with the understanding that, eventually it's going to move up the line if there's a water quality violation, and sometime down the road there'll be follow-up. As you may be aware, DEQ is working through TMDLs, and it's sort of the process is not particularly speedy, and the sort of 5-year return process is not particularly speedy either. The other time that it would show up would be in the status and trend reports that get done as part of the Ag Water Quality Management Plan reviews. That would probably be where it would show up.
Okay.
But as to specifically what action would be taken, I'm afraid that's outside of my experience realm.
Hey, Steve, this is York. Do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, you'd be great. Thanks, York.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is York Johnson. I work for DEQ as well. I'm the North Coast Basin Coordinator. And so I just really want to make a kind of a plug for this process and get at the question that was asked too. So once we get this information into this AWOMS database, DEQ has been working on developing a lot of tools to then utilize this data to help communicate back to local folks what we're seeing with our water quality changes over time. So in this scenario where you have a listed stream and you have a TMDL in place and you're doing this ongoing monitoring, this type of process will allow us to have the information to come back to you and say, okay, you've been doing implementation over the last 5 years. This is the change we're seeing in water quality, whether it's positive or negative or not. And it's a really good communication tool. I think Steve was right on that this is not enforcement, but this is a strategy to let people know how well they're doing. And I think it's something that DEQ and OWEB are really interested in, and it's really the value of the data that local folks are collecting, because the state doesn't really have the resources to get this type of information. So I just want to highlight the value that everyone is contributing when they are out there collecting this data and feeding it into this general database. It's really going to allow us to utilize this data to help tell the story of improvements locally. So definitely valuable, and hopefully, as we get these processes going and more efficient, DEQ, through their basin coordinators, which cover the entire state, or others, will be able to take this information and say, this is what this information is telling us. This is what we're seeing happening in water quality, and relate that to the on-the-ground actions that are taking place.
Great, York. I totally agree with that, and the articulation was spot on. We want to be in the trenches. We just do not want to destroy that trust. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, York, and thanks for the question. It's a good concern from a lot of different groups that we're hearing from. So thank you for bringing up that question. So moving on, we do have a few more slides here before we get to our monitoring group kind of testimonial. But some of the data submission considerations that we want people to be aware of is that not all of the data that, particularly non-standard kind of projects, not all data that you submit to the DEQ will make it into AWOMS, even though your grant might require you submitting the data to us for some form of review. There are certain aspects of water quality data that the AWOMS does not take in. One particular example would be the Partnership for Umpqua Rivers is doing kind of a pothole study on HABs and algae growth. That kind of data doesn't really qualify or give a status of a water body as much as it is just kind of a localized research question. So that data can't be associated with an actual point on a river necessarily. So it doesn't fit into the AWOMS database that way. Same with some projects that we've come across with cold water refugia sampling, where you have multiple continuous data loggers for temperature in the same location on a stream, and very small kind of remote kind of microclimate kind of measurements. that kind of data doesn't fit well into the general broader picture of water quality, the AWOMS thing. So we will take a look at that data and kind of give an evaluation on the water quality or not the water quality, but the quality assurance of those types of projects. But just be aware that data might not make it into AWOMS because it doesn't fit that kind of format. And we already mentioned this before, but if some of you are utilizing or partnering with other agencies that have your data, that will then from their end push the data into Storette. We won't bring that data into AWOMS because we'll be mirroring with the water quality portal, and so we want to avoid that redundant data. There are certain aspects, other things such as continuous gauging data, habitat data and physical parameters, and fish tissue or kind of fish population data that I don't think we're currently storing in AWOMS either, but we will, we can take a look at that data and, consider it for quality review and give a report back to you and OWEB about your data submissions, but those kind of items won't make it into AWOMS either. But to emphasize again, if you talk with us ahead of time, it gives us an idea of what kind of data is coming in and prepares us for any kind of non-standardized parameters. So the sooner we know about what your project is holding, the sooner we can provide assistance with that submission. This program, myself and Steve, we're here to help. So all of the steps we kind of went through this at the beginning, but these are all the different ways that we can provide assistance, whether it be advice, equipment, supplies, helping with methods development, certainly part of the quality assurance planning, what we can do to help you, as well as what we can do to provide quality data that comes into the DEQ. We're going to give the screen over to Julie Hoff.
Yep.
And Melanie Dunn is also going to be participating. Let me see if I can find you here and share the screen.
So my name is Julie Huff. I am the monitoring coordinator with the Copial Watershed Association. Mel, I'll let you jump in and introduce yourself.
I'm Melanie Dunn. I'm the director over at the Watershed.
And Nick and Ken just asked us to kind of talk a little bit about our experience with the Winter Lakes Monitoring Grant and the SAP development. I'll start with a little bit of background. The Winter Lake Monitoring Project stems from the Winter Lake Tidegate Replacement and Restoration Project. We are on the southern Oregon coast, so a lot of our watershed is tidally influenced. So the Winter Lake Tidegate Replacement and Restoration Project, the main activities happened in 2017 and 2018. There were 7 tidegates with the MPR technology installed, draining a 1,700-acre area. And with those 7 tidegates, you can see in that lower photo there, it's a fairly impressive structure. And the tidegates break up that 1,700 acres into 3 hydrologically separate units. 1,300 acres are used for pasture and ag, grazing mainly. And then there's 1 unit of 400 acres that was used for wildlife and fish habitat restoration. And within that 400 acres, 8 miles of new channel were created. You can see that upper right-hand photo is the construction of the channels. And then 5 tidal depressions were created, and those are just kind of like ponds. And quite a bit of planting was done within that 400 acres, almost 100,000 willows and trees and shrubs were planted. And so that's the background kind of the restoration side. Onto the monitoring side, you can see the map on the right-hand side. This is the whole 1,700 acres. It's quite large. And the list of monitoring parameters, it's a fairly complex project and kind of dabbling in a little bit of everything in terms of monitoring. But I kind of like to think of it in terms of we're monitoring for 3 things. The first being water quality and quantity. The second being the site's physical and landscape attributes. So that would be like channel depth and vegetation composition, those sorts of things. And then the third is the response of salmonids to the restoration, and then also to the listed monitoring parameters. We've kind of got it spread out across the whole field, so it makes for fun field work. And then our monitoring methods, we also do a little bit of everything. We have quite a few continuous data loggers. We also do grab samples, fish trapping and pit tagging, channel cross sections, photo points, and then aerial drone flights. And I'm going to throw it over to Mel for the SAP development, since I was not on the project when it started.
As Julie mentioned, I was the primary author of our OWEB grant and early coordinator for getting this project on the ground. And then we brought Julie on once we were awarded the grant. So I'll be providing some details on how we developed the project and the SAP, and then what we learned from that process. So before we submitted the grant, we did have our local DEQ basin specialist as part of our project team, and then we discussed the SAP during that planning process and grant development process. I feel like it wasn't quite the weight and the extent of the development wasn't quite fully grasped by our project team of exactly how much time and what parameters we need to ensure we're covered under that. And some background on that is that we wrote our monitoring grant off of our monitoring and adaptive management plan that was required with the permits that were obtained for the restoration project. And so we were, that was kind of our primary guiding document rather than having the SAP in mind as we were going through that. And so then because of that, we also didn't quite put enough staff time in our budget to cover the development of the SAP. And so I think part of it too is that I was also new to the position, so it was kind of a situation where we were just learning about the monitoring grants, and I wasn't quite sure what questions to ask up front on what was required as part of the SAP. But once we were awarded the grant, we started conversations with the DEQ volunteer monitoring coordinator, which I believe it was Steve right at the beginning, and then quickly switched over to Nick. And so once we got rolling with that, the process went well. It took some staff time to get it all developed, but as already articulated during the webinar, there's a lot of online resources. And then we also had some other local examples from other local watershed groups and the Soil and Water Conservation District that had developed SAPs that we used as models. So having those resources was really helpful. But in hindsight, we definitely recognize that communicating early and often with our basin specialist and the volunteer monitoring coordinator would be really helpful. So that way we have a better expectation of what will be required on our end for the SAP development and potentially the QAPP development, and what parameters we need to be sure we're including, and what protocols we need to be covering as part of the reporting requirements. The data requirements were, some of the sampling requirements were above what we initially budgeted for, such as having a 10% additional sampling or repeated samples to have some QA/QC built in. But we're really glad that we were able to go through the SAP development, so that way we have that data, and it's at a much higher caliber than what was initially in our guiding monitoring and adaptive management plan document. And so then kind of on the second half of the slide on the screen of what you should do, definitely whenever you're kind of crafting your idea and working with landowners and other technical advisors to craft a monitoring project, that's also when reaching out to Nick will be really critical. And then also just accounting, again, for the SAP development time in the budget, and also the extra data processing and potential additional sampling to meet their requirements. So just making sure that you have that in mind as you're developing your grant budget. And then lastly, I know this is already also mentioned before, but it's good to reiterate that Nick he's here as a resource for all of us, but he's also working with all of us, so he's busy. So being really proactive on planning out when you'll need your SAP developed and finalized by, so that way you can start working and communicating with him and giving him enough time to review things and get back to you, because there's a lot on his plate as well. So making sure you're factoring in that time for DEQ and other partners review. And I think that's all I have on that process, Julie. So I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mel. So then I just wanted to kind of touch on what we thought were the main highlights of working with DEQ and the volunteer monitoring program. First, it was really nice to have kind of the best protocols for collecting data already established. There's no point in reinventing the wheel, and I think it's also important for watershed groups to be collecting data similarly from watershed to watershed. Second, the data that we're collecting is, very high quality data, which means that it can be used beyond what our project is. It can be used for other organizations, put it onto the AWOMS website and data collection site. The kind of the highlight, I would say, is that DEQ provides us with all the audit equipment that we need. So they've loaned us NIST thermometers and DEO meters, which are expensive and also expensive to calibrate and keep up to date, and they do that for us, which is we really appreciate it. And then lastly, local DEQ staff has really helped us a lot. They've come out and helped us calibrate the DEO loggers, deployed them out in the field. They've loaned us sulfuric acid for our water quality graph samples. So it's just been really a great relationship that we've had with the local DEQ staff, and then also Nick up in Salem. So we really appreciate it. And now onto data management, which, the first time I opened up the Excel spreadsheet for the continuous data loggers that I'm sure many of you have opened also, I looked at the headers and I thought, what is this? I love spreadsheets and I love data a lot, but it didn't seem straightforward to me, which, that's okay. So what I basically did was I took that information and just put it into a new spreadsheet that was easier for me to kind of understand at a first glance. And everyone, organizes their data differently, but I just thought I'd share with you how we organize our data. And we also, as you saw, how many parameters we have. We have quite a bit of data, so it's more important to be fairly well organized with the larger project. So for every continuous data logger, I have 3 different spreadsheets. I have one spreadsheet for just the continuous data, and that's what you're downloading off of the data logger. Then I have a second spreadsheet for all of the field audits, and that's what you see on that lower spreadsheet. That's a field audit for our HOBO U26, which reads temperature and dissolved oxygen. And then I have a third spreadsheet for the lab audits. So those are the pre and post deployment audits and calibrations that we do in the lab. So 3 spreadsheets for each data logger type. And then within those 3 spreadsheets, I have a separate tab for each data logger. And I found that it keeps it fairly well organized, and when it's time to submit our data to DEQ, I just, highlight the data that I need to submit and put it right into their spreadsheet, and, you don't have to change rows around or columns around or anything like that. It works pretty well. This is just kind of a handful of suggestions we wanted to give to other groups that were applying for a monitoring grant and also developing SAP. So I think you've heard this before. Get in touch with DEQ early, but we think that's the most important aspect. There's only one Nick, and there's lots of us, and we tend to have questions all around the same time period since we're on the same granting cycle. And then also what we found was really helpful was, and I'm not sure if it was Nick or Steve, they gave us an example SAP that was similar to our project. And so that was really helpful to create our, based off of that. The third, and this is for budgeting, make sure you add extra staff time, not just for the SAP development, but the data processing. That takes a little bit more time, but you end up with really high quality data. And then the third is extra staff time for the audit, so the lab audits and calibration for pre and post deployment, and then extra staff time for the field audit. So it's more than just downloading the data loggers. And then extra budget in the materials or contracted services. And that's for, one is the redundancy on sampling, 10% for grab samples. That was kind of an afterthought for us. And then two is just the equipment that is not frequently used for monitoring. So for us, that would be velocity meters, or I should say that we don't use frequently, velocity meters in the DEO data loggers. Those are the two things that have cost more for, setup and just continued maintenance. Again, start communication early with DEQ and make sure you're working with both your local basin specialists and Nick. And then the last thing is just ask Nick, make sure, give him your list of parameters, and make sure you're very explicit about, which ones need to be included in the SAP and which don't. So those are all the suggestions that we have, and I will pass it back to Mel.
And then we also just wanted to close with some other suggestions on for OWEB and DEQ. So for DEQ, just making sure that the basin specialists know to refer organizations to Nick when monitoring projects arise. That was a great resource on our end when we started with this project. This was relatively new for our organization. We hadn't had many OWEB monitoring grants or potentially any OWEB monitoring grants prior to this one. So especially if it's an organization that's new to these grants, making sure that either the OWEB RPR or the local DEQ basin specialist is referring the organizations to Nick. And then also, again, just emphasizing that the DEQ data standards are very high, so the specific requirements, 10% redundancy, field audits, they need to be met, which does take more staff time, but you're getting a much higher quality product out of that. So it's well worth it, but just making sure that organizations and applicants are aware of those standards at the forefront of embarking on the project. And then Julie and I were talking, we're starting to switch gears and think about how we're going to be analyzing all of our data and displaying that and moving into that realm. And so we were thinking it'd be, now that we've had this webinar on SAP development and sampling and reporting, having another follow-up potentially on the analysis of parameters and sharing information among organizations on how they're using their data and analyzing their data. We think that'd be a really interesting follow-up to this webinar. But with that, I think that's all we have.
Thank you so much, Mel and Julie, for highlighting your guys' experience and sharing your project with everybody. And so we will, right now, if folks have questions for Mel and Julie, why don't you guys ask those? Otherwise, we have maybe one more slide, and then we can open it up. But any questions for Mel and Julie? What we could do is follow up is, I think their resources too, I'm sure Mel and Julie would be happy to, answer any questions or maybe even provide their SAP as an example. If you have a similar, complex project that has a lot of those similar parameters, potentially their SAP could be a good model for you to pull some information from as well. So I'll throw that out there too.
Thanks again, Julie and Melanie, for giving that perspective. I really appreciate it, and I'm already making notes about potential future webinars. Or we hear you on the submission template for the data. I think moving forward and getting feedback on that and potentially making adjustments to the submission form, making it more straightforward would be good, but at the same time not wanting to make it harder for people who are already used to the current template. But I'm sure we can kind of slowly make some progress on that and making it more user-friendly. Ken mentioned we have plenty of time here for the rest of the webinar to kind of open it up to discussion for other groups that want to share their experiences or have advice for new grantees, and feedback for us. Obviously, we don't always get everything right, or the timing, and like we've pointed out probably several times, it can be a time-consuming process for us and for you to go through a lot of these steps we've talked about. So if you have feedback that might make things more streamlined or more efficient from your perspective, we'd be open to suggestions as well.
Hey Ken and Nick, this is Lauren with Upper Deschutes Watershed Council. We have a quality assurance project plan. We do not have a sampling and analysis plan. I know that our QAPP needs to be updated, but my question is about whether organizations need both a QAPP and a SAP, or if a QAPP is sufficient as long as it's current.
Yeah, no, you need some type of plan, whether it's a QAPP or a SAP, doesn't matter, but you need one or the other. If you have quite a large organization, the two things just exist because in some cases it's more efficient to have an umbrella with SAPs underneath that. That would be reasonably rare. Like in the instance of my current position, I'm the TMDL monitoring coordinator. There's a TMDL monitoring QA plan, and as we go around the state, different projects create SAPs. That's really how we apply the two different types of documents. Most organizations, if you really kind of only have a couple of monitoring projects, it just makes sense if you can fit the monitoring project pretty neatly under the DEQ volunteer monitoring QA plan, then you can call your document a SAP and fit it under there. I can't remember if your QA plan had all the multi-parameter DataSON stuff that you guys have done in the past. Like
it
that,
does.
At the time, that wouldn't have fit very well under our QA plan, so it would have made a lot of sense for you just to develop a QA plan instead of an SAP. That's a really good example of where you would probably want to apply that type of thing, that type of SAP or first QAPP application. But again, as I said, it's really, there's just kind of a semantics between a QAPP and a SAP. They're really the exact same. They cover the exact same document. It's just in a SAP you can reference a QA plan and say, we're going to do this portion of that what we're talking about. We're talking about data management in section B10. It sticks in my head. And we're just going to follow what is in the QA plan. The reverse doesn't usually apply.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, for asking that.
We have another comment. OWEB grant applications are character limited, so sometimes hard to include QA/QC details in the application. Maybe make this a condition approved QAPP of first release of grant funds.
Thank you for that. And that is something that we're working to do, where we're aware a QA plan needs to be updated or created. That is in the grant conditions. To a certain degree, the character limits are really intending so that the applicant be clear and concise. And we have different questions in there that talk about, what methods you're following, and then what's your study design. But then you can also, write a clear and concise statement about that. But then you can also upload, say, a monitoring plan or a protocol or a quality assurance plan that you have to help the review team better understand what documents you have. But it's also important to clearly answer the question, because often folks just say, hey, see uploads, and there's 500 pages of uploads, and the review team isn't going to be able to sort through all that. You're still obligated to answer the question in the application.
Yeah, I may try to address some of the comments that's about the workload and things. We really want to try to make this process as efficient as possible without compromising the quality of the data that's being collected. We're very open to suggestions about how to make the process more efficient. I'll leave it up to Nick to talk about sampling plan recommendations for him, but I was really looking for brief bullet point type presentation, just making sure that all the information that we could foresee being needed was included. For data management, it's really critical to take a look at the data templates before you start managing the data in some other way, so that you don't create sort of contradicting data formats. And if you do come across a challenge in how the data is currently stored in your system and how we're asking for it, please make sure that you talk to us and see if we can figure out a way to deal with something that would be as efficient as possible for everybody. We have to have sort of defined template in order to handle all the different data that comes in, and there's tons of challenges around that, but there might be some flexibility about how we can bring data in.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Well, there's just concern that if we make it too specialized, that it's going to be harder. It might discourage monitoring grants. That if the process becomes too onerous, that it might discourage grants.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, it's a competitive grant program, right? And so OWEB should be funding the projects that are going to collect the highest quality data and have the best use and intent of those funds. And so I think we're trying to lift everybody here, and with using standardized methods, having quality in place, all the water quality monitoring efforts in Oregon are going to get lifted, and some of the folks are already successful in doing that, and they can serve as resources and help others and model that those efforts that we're looking for. We have our contact information up there. You guys feel free to reach out to me or Nick and Steve, or also your OWEB project manager if you have any questions or concerns, and I'll do our best to answer those.
We did have a couple more comments just come in the chat box. There was one, just curious if any watershed councils are involved with continuous gauges. I believe.
Yeah, there are a few projects, quite often partnering with OWRD, and I can't recall. Ken, are there some with USGS? You're probably.
Yeah, so there's some that they take those OWEB funds and then contract with Water Resources or USGS separately, but one of the long-standing grantees that does continuous gauges is the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council. And then also, relatively in the last 4 or 5 years, the Malheur Watershed Council and SWCD also works with a private contractor to run gauges. Those are two that come to mind that I can think of readily that are kind of doing it in-house.
This is Freeland Reeser over here at the Coos Watershed. We also run.
Oh, that's right. Hey, thanks, Freeland. Sorry about that. I knew I was forgetting somebody. So yeah, that's Freeland Reeser at the Coos Watershed Association, and he's been running a hydrologic monitoring program for over 10 years there on the South Coast, and so certainly could be a reference for others interested in doing similar type of monitoring.
We have another comment. If you have a new monitoring program, what conclusions can you draw from just 1 or 2 years of data at a site for the final report and analysis?
This is kind of getting into the next webinar, but one of the common, and actually there may still be a presentation on our webpage about this that talks a little bit about it, but quite commonly people will, we're not going to be doing trend analysis on that, but quite often you can do kind of a status comparison, which is quite often looking at if there's an applicable water quality standard, or if you, for something like, say, conductivity that doesn't have a water quality standard, just comparing between sites or comparing against other reference, maybe if there's a DEQ ambient station or some other data source that you can sort of compare against for parameters that don't have benchmarks defined. The other place is if you're doing monitoring in a basin that has a TMDL, say if it has a dissolved oxygen TMDL or a pH TMDL, quite often they'll have nutrient, quite often a total phosphorus value that they're trying to meet. So finding some sort of logical benchmarks to compare against is, as a status assessment, is how that I see most commonly done for 1 or 2 years of data. And if the data comes in to DEQ and is processed and has all the QC information, that will get done for you by the DEQ when they do the status and trends reports.
Okay, we have another comment. Thanks for the webinar. I enjoyed hearing about Coquille Watershed Association's work. I'd like to hear about more monitoring projects throughout the state. Currently, I don't think we have, at least on the webpage, we don't have a kind of an ongoing list of volunteer or partners with the volunteer monitoring program, although we do occasionally kind of publish or kind of talk about examples and good projects that are interesting.
Yeah, somebody did make the comment that I just responded to in the chat box and didn't talk about, but about posting the sample analysis plans on the DEQ webpage. That is something that I think we should think about. There seems to be some complication since we can't even seem to get our own sample analysis plans on the webpage. And maybe that's something that we could work with OWEB about, that we could post it through OWEB if we're having a hard time getting past our issues. But that might be one way. That's kind of something that's been brought up, having the sample plans available for other people to look at, something that Julie and Melanie talked about. So that's something we could look into.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for the question and comment. I agree. I think there's a lot of value in hearing Mel and Julie's experience and learning about their project to help build connections and networking opportunities. And so that is something that we heard about when we were soliciting feedback on ways to improve our application and guidance for applicants to help submit successful and competitive applications, but also, have successful projects once they're funded. And so those are things that we are thinking about here at OWEB to help try to support. OWEB has a strategic plan that was approved in June of last year, and Priority 6 is coordinated monitoring. and there are 6 strategies under that to help implement that priority. And so one of them is around sort of developing these regional monitoring frameworks. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do to make people aware, either using our website or have, reoccurring webinars like this, or meetings where we all get together and can share information. And so those are things that OWEB hopes to do as we implement our new strategic plan over the next 5 to 10 years. And hopefully some of that stuff can happen sooner rather than later. But that's a great suggestion, and I'm really glad that you guys are finding this information useful.
Okay, so that's the end of the chat box comments or questions. We really do appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk about the OWEB and DEQ Volunteer Monitoring Program relationship and how we can help grantees become partners within the program.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo that. Thanks, Nick and Steve, for taking the time to walk through some of these important steps, and we really appreciate everybody joining in today to learn more. And so we can follow up once I figure out with Nick and Steve how best to make that webinar available. I'll follow up with that link and information. And so, hope everybody has a successful monitoring season this year, and look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, guys.